All right, Jim Mustich, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Brad. It's really a pleasure to speak with you.
So you've had a career in books for a long time. You've been in the business in books as a reviewer, an editor, a bookseller, and you finally got around to writing a book. And it's a book about books. So tell us, how did you get to this point where you decided it was time to write a book? It's called 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die.
As you mentioned, I've been in the book business my whole life. I started at an independent bookstore in the early 1980s in suburban New York. And from that, I had the idea to start my own business in 1986. I started up a catalog called A Common Reader, which was a catalog that we mailed out across the country. Usually it was about 144 pages, where I and some other colleagues would write about books. It was very personal. We'd find generally offbeat books or neglected books that weren't on people's radar. And we grew a very nice business doing that. And I did it for about 20 years, till at the end of it, we had a mailing list, subscription list of about 250,000 people. And it had lots of the flavors of a book blog or a website, but we had started it before the internet. And so we did it in the mail. And through that experience of writing about books and of interacting with the readers of the catalog who would buy books from us and send us wonderful letters about what they thought of the books, but also recommending other books. My wife and I still have 6 or 8 file cabinets in our basement filled with these letters of people talking about their favorite books. And that got me, writing about books a lot. And so in the early 2000s, Peter Workman, who was the founder of Workman Publishing, which is the publisher of 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die, he was a great fan of my catalog, and he had published very successfully a book by Patricia Schultz called 1,000 Places to See Before You Die, which some of your listeners may be familiar with. And that was very successful. And Peter decided he wanted to do a book like that about books. So he asked me to do it. I worked on it for 14 years, and it was finally published in October.
I can tell that it took 14 years. It's large, and the descriptions are just fantastic. They're very detailed, and they make you want to read the books you highlight. But I'm curious, like, what was your guiding ethos as you selected these books? Like, why 1,000? Because it's a large number, but it's not but it's not like 10,000, right?
Right.
So, like, why 1,000? What was your ethos as you went about selecting these books?
Well, that's a great question, and it puzzled me for a long time because I had been a reader for decades and a bookseller for decades as well by the time I began. And so I had so many books on a list that could potentially be included. The number 1,000 came with the project from Workman because they had done 1,000 places and they wanted to do a series. So that was kind of my starting point, which I didn't have much negotiating power about, but it seemed okay. But as the more I thought about it, the more complicated it became, because I would joke with Patricia Schultz, who wrote 1,000 Places, that conceptually her job was easy because you could just take a map and the structure of the book would be determined by the map. And any reader of her book would understand that what the structure was, because people are all familiar with maps of the world. But when you're talking about 1,000 books, you could take many different approaches to it. You could have the 1,000 most popular books of all time, the 1,000 most important books of all time. You could create a canon of classics. You could do it by age of reader. And since books encompass within them all of human knowledge, you have all different kinds of subjects. You could do it by subject if you wanted to, by history, science, so on. So I had all these books, but organizing them was a bit of a puzzle to me until I came upon a quote that really struck me, which was from the great literary critic Edmund Wilson. In one of his books, he talks about the miscellaneous learning of a bookstore unorganized by any larger purpose. And I said to myself, that's what I want. I want readers to open this book. They might be looking for something in particular, but they could really be empowered to browse around and follow their own instincts. So how can I get something that would be fun in that way, that would give the user, the reader, some agency in going through the book? So I said to myself, what if I had a bookstore? I could only have 1,000 books, and I wanted to have something for every kind of reading appetite. If somebody walked into this metaphorical store and said, I want a book about ancient Greece, or I'm getting on a plane for a long plane ride, I want a really absorbing thriller, or I want some picture books to share with my kids. I wanted to have something for everyone. So that's kind of how I structured it.
And I love that structure and that metaphor, because it really, when you're reading this, it's like you're in like a cool bookstore and you're just like, oh, I wasn't looking for that, but I'm glad I stumbled upon it, and now I'm going to buy this book. Now, what's interesting about book lists, because they're all over the internet. We have our own on our site, and every time we've published book list on our site, it always raises ires of readers because we left out a book, or we have the gall to make a normative claim that these are the books you should read. Have you gotten that with this book, or?
Yeah, well, welcome to my world, Brett. I write in the introduction something that I learned very early as I was working on this book, that once people know you're writing a book called 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die, you can never enjoy a dinner party in quite the same way as you did before, because everyone would want to know what's in it. They'd want to know if their favorites are in it. They'd have recommendations and so on. So I hear you loud and clear. I get that all the time. But much to my delight, as I've gone around, I spent most of the fall going to bookstores and libraries around the country talking about the book. And all of those conversations have been tremendously fun and polite and generous. And so I've learned a lot. My listeners and readers have learned a lot. And because everybody's passionate about what they love. So it's a never-ending task of adding new books to my own list of things to read, but also for the discussion. And part of what I wanted to share with people was the love of that conversation. I mentioned to you before all those letters I used to get from customers of A Common Reader, and the conversations about 1,000 books have been the same thing. People coming, wanting to see if something was in there, arguing in a merry way about their own favorites. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, the first thing I did when I got your book is like, are my favorite books in here? And they were. All of them were. It was fantastic.
Oh,
You've got
I'm
great.
glad.
You got great. Yeah, Lonesome Dove, I was happy to see was in there. The Road was in there. The Great Gatsby, yes. Very happy to see that. Catch 22. All my favorites. So I was glad to see those all made the list. But as a person who's a reader, a connoisseur of books, like, what do you think of book lists? Like, how do you think they're helpful for readers?
Well, I think there are so many books being published every week, and there are so many books that have been published in the past, and there are so many byways in a library or a bookstore, that I think lists are very helpful if they are made by the maker of the list in a generous way to share knowledge or enthusiasm in a way that's inviting rather than prescriptive. Lists can give people the sense that, oh boy, this is a big homework assignment. And I don't like that approach at all. What I like to do is to invite people, here, look at this. I think you'll be interested in this, and to kind of encourage them. The epigraph to my book, let me read it now because it's right on this subject. It's from Virginia Woolf. She had an essay called How Should One Read a Book? And this is what she says, and this is the way I feel. The only advice that one person can give another about reading is to take no advice, to follow your own instincts, to use your own reason, to come to your own conclusions. If this is agreed between us, then I feel at liberty to put forward a few ideas and suggestions, because you will not allow them to fetter that independence, which is the most important quality that a reader can possess. So what I can do as a longtime bookseller and a knowledgeable reader is to make a list and put in front of people things that they might not be familiar with, or maybe they were a little afraid to tackle before. But again, I try to do it in a very encouraging way. The 1,000 books in my book, it's not a test. I say to people, open the book anywhere, look for your favorites, and then poke around and see what what suggests itself to you.
Yeah, I love that epigraph. And that's kind of how I always approach book lists. I never see it as like, oh, this guy's telling me what I should read. You bug off guy. Like, it's like, oh, I just take it as, oh, this is interesting. This is this guy's take. Maybe I'll find something new. But there's some people that, man, they get really fiery when they're told this is what you need to read. But I love that quote from Virginia Woolf. Well, I mean, let's dig into the books you included and the genres you included, because typically when people make book lists, there's like, it's always like the classics or highbrow, non-fiction or nonfiction that people should read. But you've got sci-fi in there. I was really pleasantly surprised by the number of sci-fi books you have on your list. Why do you think sci-fi often gets the short shrift on book lists?
Well, I think when it comes to book lists, even the people making them approach it as a kind of homework. And let's face it, most of us who do these lists were English majors at one point or another. So we have this sense of the classic works, which are generally the books that are taught. And sci-fi only recently has been kind of accepted into that conversation. But I believe that genre works and are really where people's imaginations flower, not just the writers, but the readers. Because when you get a great work of sci-fi and the author is building a world, it's so full of ideas and interesting things that it far outstrips, in terms of mental exercise or mental exhilaration, what you might get in a very good literary novel about, a couple living in Manhattan or something. The book can be great, but you're not stretching ideas and kind of, in the exact sense in sci-fi, creating worlds for people to explore. And so I love when people expand their kind of spirits by going into sci-fi. You can even do it in romance or in children's books, where the sense of story is really allowed to take over.
Are there any sci-fi books that, just from the list, the ones you include in your list, that are like good starting points for people who maybe they've always been turned off by sci-fi because they're like, well, that's just sort of, that was what the nerds read in high school, but I want to get into, like, what would you recommend?
That's a good question. I like one that really excited me is a book called The Star Is My Destination by Alfred Bester. That's one that really got me hooked. And it was written in the 50s. And it's essentially a retelling of the Count of Monte Cristo in outer space. There's a lot of revenge and someone disappears for years, but it's so fast paced. People can kind of teleport themselves from one place to another. And it's just exciting. You get caught up in the story. There are ideas there. Many ideas in science fiction turn up, decades later as being new technologies. So that's a good place to start. I love that one. There's, the classics like Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, or edgier stuff like J.G. Ballard more recently, who writes terrifically absorbing and kind of frightening books that have you on the edge of your seat, both physically and metaphysically.
Yeah, Isaac Asimov, I'm just starting to get into him. And one thing that surprised me about him I didn't know is like how much that guy wrote. Like, he had a tremendous amount of output.
When I started out in the book business, we used to joke, this was in the early 80s, he was such a polymath that not only did he write science fiction and serious works of science, he seemed to have a book on every subject in the bookstore. There'd be a book, in the religion section, in the history section. He wrote about everything. A truly phenomenally prolific and smart writer.
And the one that I think got me into science fiction was Ender's Game by...
Yeah, what a great book. I read that when my daughters are both grown now in their 20s. But when my elder daughter was reading it, she said to me, "You got to read this." And I couldn't agree more. What a terrific book. And
that must be nice too. What the nice thing about sci-fi is that it can cross generations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, not only young people like them, but older people can like them as well. So let's move another genre that it was included in your list that you often don't see on book lists, because again, when people make book lists, they try to be snobbish, or they think of it as homework. And this genre is often looked down upon as lowbrow, and that's crime fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Why does crime fiction why is it seen as lowbrow? Because when I've read crime fiction, like really good crime fiction, Dashiell Hammett, the writing's just top notch. So why does it get overlooked and sort of snubbed?
I think, for years, people thought that it wasn't engaging serious themes, but it is, to me, there's two appeals to crime fiction. One is there's just the puzzle of what's happening. Another great appeal is atmosphere. Dashiell Hammett's San Francisco, or Raymond Chandler's Los Angeles, or Sherlock Holmes's London. Those are great places to be in your imagination. So that's part of it too. But I think there's also a lot about how you approach the world. Sherlock Holmes in approaching problem solving or just thinking about things, that you eliminate, when you eliminate all the impossible things, no matter how extraordinary the answer seems, that's probably it. But also about how to behave under stress. In Hammett and in Chandler, you have people, detectives, who are wandering through murky areas of behavior and morality and trying to uphold some kind of personal code that may not be pristine in its virtue, but that it has to work in the real world. And I think that's really important. That's why people like to read about Hammett's detectives, or even Jack Reacher in the Lee Child novels, or Michael Connelly's Harry Bosch. These are men, they're women detectives as well, in the same situation where they're trying to navigate a world in which the answers aren't clear, that right and wrong aren't always clearly demarcated. And I think people vicariously take some solace from that.
Yeah, that's like real life.
Yep.
And I think the other appeal to detective novels is that the detective is like the American version. There's also British and other countries, but like it's a primarily American phenomenon. It's like the American version of like a knight errant, right? He's like,
yes, well put, exactly.
Right, like, he's not a good guy, not a bad guy. Doesn't really work for it. He's on his own, but he's trying to figure out what's good.
Yep.
Any books there that you'd recommend people start off with if they want to get into crime fiction?
Well, I was just talking about this last night, and it depends, on your taste, but my own favorites, and I say this because I have a pile of them right outside the bedroom, and there's always one on my nightstand, are the Rex Stout novels about a detective named Nero Wolfe. Now, I don't know if you know those, but he started writing them in the late 30s, and he wrote them all the way into the late 70s. So there's about 40 something of them. And I've read them, several of them, many times. I tend to forget who actually, did the crime, but the characters are so wonderful. Nero Wolfe, the main character, is this obese man who almost never leaves his house. He lives in this brownstone in Manhattan. He's a gourmet, and he has a cook who lives with him. He keeps orchids on his roof. He has 10,000 plants, and he has all of these quirky personal characteristics. But the books are narrated by his assistant, Archie Goodwin, who is much more like a Hammett or a Raymond Chandler detective. So Archie goes out and has all the adventures, and then he brings everything back to Wolfe, and Wolfe, with his genius, figures out the crime. So in these books, you get the pleasures of two kinds of detective fiction. One is like the Sherlock Holmes or the Hercule Poirot, where you have this genius figuring stuff out, but you also have the hard-boiled type where somebody's going out and getting into fist fights and the like. And so there's a great mix of them there, and I just love them. I mean, I call it comfort reading.
I love it. And I love how you have comfort reading on this list, which is pleasant, right? Because most lists are sort of a chore.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to do in making the book is, I really believe, I know this is true of myself, and I know from the many readers I've talked to over the years, it's true of a wide group of readers, is that we really read. It's not all seriousness. We read the way we eat. And so one day we may feel like having a healthy salad, granola for breakfast and a salad for lunch. But the next day we're walking down the street, we're hungry, and we see a hot dog truck, and we really feel like having a hot dog. And then 2 nights later, we may go out for a very fancy dinner in a high-end restaurant. All of those meals are satisfying. They all speak to hungers that we have and to our appetites. And our appetites as readers are not the same all the time. Just like our appetite for food changes, our appetite for reading does as well. So, you want a couple of bags of potato chips in the list of books as well as nutritious meals.
And that's how I've approached my reading. I belong to a book group here in town in Tulsa where we're reading the great books. We started at the Iliad. Now we've worked our way. We finished the Divine Comedy, and a lot of those books, some of them are really a joy to read, enjoyable, like Inferno and Purgatorio, really fun to read. It's sort of like the beginning of sci-fi or fantasy in Dante. But then but some of them are just sort of a slog. Aquinas, it's like it's hard.
Yeah, the Inferno always struck me, and I'm sure somebody has already done this, but if you read the Inferno in our day and age, it's almost like you're inside a video game,
Yeah.
where there's all these characters and you have to navigate through the different levels of hell. It's the same kind of idea. So that's a very good connection that you made. But Aquinas is not like that.
Right, yeah. But then I also read books just for fun. So right now I'm reading, so my favorite novel is Lonesome Dove. I've read it like 4 times.
Right.
And I finally decided, okay, it's time I move on. There's other books in the series. So I started with the beginning in the sequence, and now I'm in Comanche Moon. And that's what I do before I go to bed, just read a few pages. It's for pleasure. It's nothing more than that. I'm not trying to improve my life by reading Larry McMurtry novels.
Right. That variety is really important. And I try to get that in the book. And I try to also get books for every age. So you could kind of start with Goodnight Moon and Where the Wild Things Are and go all the way up to, C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed. You could really have a kind of cradle to grave reading lifetime. I wanted all of that in the book because, for people who have families, reading with their kids is really important when they're young. It's important to the kids and it's rewarding to the parents. So I wanted to point in that direction as well, and to have that sense of surprise when you could go into my book, you look for Larry McMurtry, and then next to it there might be something different. I know you mentioned The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Right after that in my book is a wonderful picture book for kids called Make Way for Ducklings, and so that juxtaposition is really what I was after, to kind of surprise people a little bit.
Yeah, that is a stark juxtaposition there. I mean, so yeah, you include children's books on the list, and that's another thing you often don't see on book lists. What were some of the highlights that from that list or of genre of children's book that you have on there?
Well, there's the one that I particularly like, and it's a book aimed at an audience of around 12-year-olds. And it's written by a man named Russell Hoban, Hoban. And he is fairly singular in the book among writers, because he's famous for 2 things at the opposite ends of the literary spectrum. First, he wrote a marvelous series of picture books for kids about a badger named Francis. A Birthday for Francis, Best Friends for Francis. These books have been around for 30 or 40 years. They still sell very well, very popular in stores, just about a mischievous little animal and her family trying to keep her under control and happy. They're marvelous, fun books. Then he wrote novels for adults, the most famous of which is Ridley Walker, and they're kind of speculative fiction in apocalyptic circumstances. But in between those 2 audiences, he wrote this book, A Mouse and His Child. And this book is about a toy mouse. It's a wind-up toy, a father mouse and a child mouse. And when the toy is wound up, the father mouse lifts up the child mouse and they dance around in a circle. And the book starts, they're happily ensconced in the toy shop, having a wonderful life with all of their toy friends. And then they get sold and they end up out in the cruel world, and they have all these kinds of harrowing adventures. And it's a novel. It's about 250 pages. It's a full-length novel. It's a gripping story. It is extraordinarily diverse in its dealing with different themes, even though it's this kind of all of these toys interacting with each other. And I say this quite honestly, and I said this many times on the book tour. This book has as much to say about being alive on the earth as any book I've ever read. Whether you're 12 or 60, I recommend it to everybody, because it's just about how we have to go out into the world and learn to be more resourceful and resilient and more imaginative than we might be if life didn't, kind of force us to do that. So it's an extraordinary book.
All right, we'll put that on our show notes. So besides fiction, there's a lot of nonfiction, and one genre of nonfiction you have in there is memoirs.
Yes.
And I've read a lot of memoirs, and a lot of them I read are terrible, but like the ones I've read are really like that are good are really good. And I can't really figure out like what makes the difference. I'm not sure, but like, what do you think makes a good memoir a good memoir?
Well, the first thing for me is generally speaking, the person has to write especially well if it's a memoir. And so the kind of character of the author's mind as it comes through his or her sentences is really important. I think of my favorite memoirs as a terrific memoir of growing up in the West, in Montana, I think it is, on sheep farms. The author's name is Ivan Doig, and he passed away a couple of years ago. But it's about him growing up with his father and his grandmother. They were kind of itinerant ranchers, and they'd go from farm to farm. And from this very hard scrabble life, he went on to take a different direction. He went to university and became a very eloquent writer. And this is his memories of that time. And the quality of the writing is extraordinary. And so he takes something of a very, could be a mundane story, and elevates it by the expansiveness of his own reflections. I think that's really important. Someone writing a memoir has to be thinking about their life and assessing it at the same time as they're repeating it to a reader. So I think that's one quality that I look for.
What's another quality you look for?
Generally, it's for me, I like finding that quality attached to experiences that are foreign to me completely, like growing up on a sheep farm. Or in other memoirs, there's a great memoir by Mary Karr called The Liars Club about growing up in Texas. I grew up in the New York metropolitan area. So the sense of place and atmosphere and even character in the people that comes from being in a different location, both physically and kind of figuratively, is really important.
Besides memoir, what other genre of nonfiction did you have a lot of fun selecting for? Was it like theology or philosophy or architecture? What was a genre that you had a lot of fun picking up books for?
Well, I love books that push us to think about big things like theology and philosophy, or mythology as well. And science fiction does this too, but in the nonfiction realm. And I think people like to engage those ideas. They like to find meaning in what they're doing. We're all so busy and we're running around doing all of the activities that our life dictates, our jobs and our families and so on. And we may be having a terrific time doing all of that. But we also want to enrich that with some sense of a larger sense of being. There's a great description in passage in a book by Norman Mailer where he talks about, if you're asked to describe yourself, you can say you are 6 feet tall and weigh so many pounds and brown eyes and so on. But we all have an existence that's separate from the description, where we really live in our inner life, that we kind of see as moving through the world. And books can help us inform that inner life in a way we don't always have a chance to do when we're at the office or however we spend our day. And so books about religion or philosophy whether or not one believes the dogmas being espoused or even the direction of the thinking, it gets us thinking about things. Why are we here? What does it mean? How can I put a little more purpose in my life? And people love to do that. They don't know how, and books help them to do it. So I think it's really important. The longest conversation and most important ongoing conversation we have in our lives is the one inside our own heads that we have with ourselves. And so books of any stripe that can give us new words and new ideas to enrich that conversation are really important.
And the thing I like about books, I mean, a lot of people get their information from social media. The problem with social media I found is that it's other people telling their opinion on things. You never have a space where you can just think about the thing on your own. But with the book, it's just you and the author.
Yes.
You don't have comments coming in saying, hot take, this is what I think. It's none of that. It's just you and the author. And then you really have a chance to think, what do I think about this idea?
That's really well said, Brett. Couldn't agree more. One of the things, in addition to the kind of heat and distemper of much of social media, is that it's all ephemeral. I write in the introduction to the book about this, and I talk about what I think of as the great amnesia of our in the moment news feeds, because not only are all of these distractions, first, distracting, second, often toxic, but they go away quickly and they're replaced by something else. They don't last. And one of the marvelous things about a book, and in this it's even different than a movie or music, is that we as readers invest a lot of our own time in a book, just as the writer has. And as we invest that time, I think this is part of what you were saying, we create space in which our thoughts can kind of, stretch their limbs and wander into places where they don't normally go. So that element of putting the time in is part of the value that we get from reading, regardless of what the individual book is.
And speaking of this ephemeral age we live in, one book that I got from your list that I read, I picked it up, read it in a day. It's a quick read that really describes this time, is Within the Context of No Context by James Trow. And it's a weird read. The guy, he's an essayist. He was an essayist for The New Yorker. His style is kind of weird. It was different.
Yes.
But he has these nuggets that when you read it, you're like, wow, this is our current age. This is crazy. And this was written in the 1980s.
Exactly. And I'm so glad that you connected with that book, because I love that book. And as you say, it's very quirky, but it's short and digestible. And he's saying all these things about there being no context for our actions anymore, that the context is being stripped away. And as you say, he's writing about this almost 40 years ago now, and he's talking about television. So I can only imagine what he'd have to say about what we're dealing with now in terms of social media and the like. But it's a very rewarding book.
Yeah, one of these points that stuck out to me is that television kind of collapsed this middle area of life. Social clubs, churches, where people would sort of socialize, and now there's broadcast world and there's intimate world, and there's no longer that middle space. And that's why everyone wants to be a celebrity, because you get to have an intimate world as well as that broadcast world. And I think it explains the whole phenomenon of social media influencers. Like, every kid wants to be a social media influencer because that's pretty much all there is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how prescient that book is.
Well, here's a list that, what I love about the book is at the end, you have sub lists.
Right.
So if you want to do children's books or books to read before you're 12 or mystery books or sci-fi, you have those lists. I'm going to have you make a new list that wasn't there. And this is the Art of Manliness podcast. So let's do a short, list of books, of manly man books every man should read before they die manfully. What would be on your list?
I would put on that list The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius by Roman emperor, great proponent of the Stoic philosophy, but very much someone in the world trying to figure out how to behave, even though he was the emperor. And it's very thoughtful, and it speaks to us now. It almost, reads in a very good way like a self-help book. Here's one quick passage from that. This is from the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Everything you're trying to reach by taking the long way round, you could have right now, this moment. If you'd only stop thwarting your own attempts, if you'd only let go of the past. And anywhere you can lead your life, you can lead a good one. So that's a terrific book, which I would really recommend to people. The second one, I already talked about, A Mouse and His Child by Russell Holdman. Whether you have kids or not, if you have kids especially, it'd be a great book to read with them. As I said, it's for about 12-year-olds, maybe 10 if you're reading it aloud together. But this book is filled with very rich life lessons about coping with what the world throws at us. So I would add that kind of maybe surprisingly for this list. The next book is a book called Endurance by Alfred Lansing, which is about Ernest Shackleton's remarkable expedition in crossing Antarctica. And it's it's a fantastic story. It's thrilling and suspenseful. Two, it is a book about leadership and bravery in remarkably trying circumstances. So I'd recommend that as well. Third book is a little more offbeat, not well known, called Independent Spirit by an Irish writer named Hubert Butler. And it's a series of essays. So this is a book you can pick up and put down and just read in 10 or 12-page essays. He's a beautiful writer, and he lived most of his life within an area of 25 miles. And he gets really into his community, its history, all the way from its archaeology to current farming concerns, but with a kind of global perspective that makes it not parochial at all, but all about how you make your life where you are, which I think is important.
He sounds like an Irish Windleberry.
Yeah, that's a great connection. I would put on there the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, which is probably the best book written by an American president. Surprisingly, given Grant's reputation, it is a marvelously written book. It's all about mostly about his military campaigns and his ability to kind of read a battlefield and read the mood of a situation is remarkably conveyed. And it's a surprisingly rich book, whether or not you're interested in the Civil War, even more so if you are, of course, but that's a worthwhile book. Also, speaking about U.S. presidents, there's a book about Lyndon Johnson called Master of the Senate by Robert Caro. Now, Caro has been writing Johnson's biography. He's written 4 volumes. There's a 5th one coming. I think he's been writing it almost as long as Johnson lived. Caro's in his 80s now. But this book is how Johnson rose to power in the Senate and then how he used it, and how he both inspired and manipulated everybody around him to pass the legislation he wanted and so on. And it sounds like it would be dry and not interesting, but it's just the opposite. I found it compelling reading. In Our Time by Ernest Hemingway, which was Hemingway's first book. It's a collection of short stories about a young man growing up in Michigan and then going from Michigan and being in World War I. It's kind of elliptical. It's about being a soldier, part of it, but it's more about someone trying to make sense of difficult experiences as he's having them and stripping away all kind of frippery from his language and his thinking to make it happen. So In Our Time by Hemingway is one I would put there. Another, I'll give you a couple more. One is Zen and the Art of Archery by Eugene Herrigel, which is about learning how to be in the moment. You don't have to be particularly interested in Zen. You don't have to be particularly interested in archery, but it's a book about getting our heads in a place where we can have mastery of experience. It's like if you play golf, for instance, which I don't, but I know that you can take a lot of lessons. But if when you're swinging the club, you're thinking about what somebody told you, you're not going to hit a good shot. You have to get beyond thinking about the mechanics of situations. And that's what Zen and the Art of Archery is about. Another book that I would recommend is a book called Adventures on the Wine Route by Kermit Lynch. It's one of my favorite books. And Kermit Lynch, as a young man, decided that he was going to open this wine shop in Berkeley, California. He really didn't know exactly what he was doing. He didn't know the business, but he taught himself. And this book is about his first trip to France and meeting all the winemakers. Kermit Lynch went on to become one of the great wine merchants and importers in America because he found all these winemakers, mostly in France, who were passionate about their work, did idiosyncratic things, and he brought them back to America. He was really a forerunner of a lot of the artisanal movement that we have now, both in wine and in beer. But this is about his discovering all of this as a young man, and it's on the order of follow your dream and figure out how you can make it work, and also have good meals and good wines while you're doing it. So it's a lot of fun. And finally, there's a book. It's a very, very thin little book called The Little Virtues, and it's by a woman named Natalia Ginzburg, who is an Italian writer. And the title essay in this book, it's about raising children and how we need to focus on how we teach them bigger virtues and how to have bigger lives. But the book is really about how the parent or the adult does this by having bigger lives themselves, that you have to have some sense of vocation and of purpose in your life that is making you get up every day with energy and good cheer, even if you're in difficult circumstances, because you have this sense of a vocation, that you're doing something that's meaningful to you. And if your children or those around you see you modeling that behavior and living in that way, that's the best influence you can give in the world to them and to yourself.
Well, James, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Is there someplace people can go to learn more about your work?
Yes, we have a website called 1000bookstoread.com, 1000bookstoread.com. Not only can they learn more about me and the book, but the whole list is there. Not all the writing that's in the book, because as you know, the book is 1,000 pages. It's a lot of writing, but I have the list of books. You get to the site, and on the homepage, there's a banner with one question that says, what book should everybody read before they die? And then there's my list, and I have a sentence or two about each book, and there's 3 buttons. You can click agree, and you can add your comments. You can click a second button that says, life's too short. I don't want to read this one. And a third button to add it to a list and build a profile so you can keep track of it. But what I really like about this, to get back to kind of where we started with your question about when you make lists on your site, people can add their own books. If there's something not on my list that you love and you want to tell people about, put it on our website. Lots of people will see it. I do a newsletter, which you could subscribe to at the website as well, 1000bookstoread.com, where we talk about what other people have added to the list. And then I have posts to a lot of other writing that I do that are posted to medium.com, just at James Mustich on Medium. And you can read what I'm reading now, and what I'm writing now is all posted there.
Fantastic. So you're keeping the conversation going about these
I'm
books.
trying.
You're doing a good job. Well, hey, Jim, thanks so much for your time. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Well, Same for me, Brett. I really appreciate it. I like what you're doing, and I've enjoyed our conversation enormously.
My guest today was Jim Mustich. He's the author of the book 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. Also, check out the website 1000bookstoread.com, where you can find more additions to the list, as well as create your own list of books to read before you die. And also check out our show notes at aom.is/1000books, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic, as well as a list of books that Jim recommended for the AOM audience. So again, check it out, aom.is/1000books.